Good evening and welcome. This is Jennifer Reynolds. I'm your host of our Armchair Travel Series. This is Jennifer's Journeys. It's 7 o'clock. It's a Friday evening, and it's time for us to travel someplace kind of fun, someplace exciting, and, well, stretch our imagination a little bit. By introduction, my name is Jennifer Reynolds. I was born and raised in Canada. I do call Tampa, Florida home now. I spent a lot of years living and working on cruise ships. And my husband, you see there, my oceanographer husband, with him I developed a very serious, deep love and passion for geography, for history, for neat little nuggets that make our world the way it is. So I thank you for joining me this evening as we explore some neat little pockets, neat little places on Jennifer's Journeys. Tonight, it's been 108 years and 2 days since the sinking of the Royal Mail steamer Titanic in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912, with a loss of 1,517 people. It's a tragic story, and it served as a great reminder of fate, for it's a drama in which extraordinary acts of heroism, cowardice, and futility played out on crowded decks, in flooded compartments, and in brutally frigid waters. My friends, this is the story of the Royal Mail ship Titanic. She was built in the sprawling shipyard of Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Northern Ireland. 11,300 shipyard workers, and she was proclaimed a masterpiece of Irish brains and industry. In the main building of Harland and Wolff was the ship drawing room, as well as the 3 canteens. There was the command center for the Titanic's chief naval architect, Thomas Andrews. He had succeeded Alexander Carlisle in 1910. Interesting, both Carlisle and Andrews were related to the chairman of Harland and Wolff. His name was Lord William Peary. Construction of the Titanic began on March 31st, 1909, when her keel was laid on slipway number 3. The yard number was 401. A simple keel laying ceremony was held, and the event was very important to Harland and Wolff, as it would mark the first payment to be received from the White Star Line. However, the White Star Line was in fact owned by a U.S. holding company called the International Mercantile Marine Company. Its headquarters was located at 1 Broadway in New York City, and the holding company was under the control of the American financier J.P. Morgan. It included several investors from New York, from Philadelphia, and Boston. In 1902, the International Mercantile Maritime Company, the IMMC, had purchased the White Star Line for $25 million. But they had kept on as their managing director a guy by the name of Bruce Ismay. The IMMC had also purchased several other British shipping lines with the goal of gaining a maritime monopoly. So the Titanic was the second of 3 ships in the same class for the White Star Line. The first was the Olympic, scrapped in 1930, and the third was the Britannic, although it was said that originally she was to be named the Gigantic. Later, the 3 ships would be remembered as the Beloved, the Damned, and the Forgotten. It was easy to tell the difference between the Olympic and the Titanic. The first-class passenger promenade was open to the weather on the Olympic, and on the Titanic, it was closed off. Also, very importantly, very fewer lifeboats, namely 20 for 1,178 people, were on the Titanic. All in all, some 3 million rivets were used in the Titanic's construction. Workers would report strange noises from deep inside the Titanic. Perhaps a worker had become entombed in her double bottom. Such things had happened before, and it was considered a very bad omen. 17 men died during the construction of Olympic and Titanic, including a father and a son. Official invitations were sent announcing the RMS Titanic was to be launched at 15 minutes after noon on the 31st of May, 1911. The morning of the launch, Lord Peary and J. Bruce Ismay made a final inspection of the Titanic on the slipway. Just before Lord Peary and officials of Harland and Wolff and the IMMC and the White Star Line posed for a photograph. It's said that over 100,000 people had come to watch the launch, some paying a small admission charge which was donated to Belfast hospitals. One of those who helped with the launch was Thomas Andrews' 5-year-old nephew named John. He was allowed to knock away one of the small wedges which held the Titanic in place on the slipway. 22 tons of soap and tallow were spread on the slipway to lubricate the ship's passage into the River Lagan. During the 62 seconds it took for the Titanic to make its journey down the slipway and into the river, a shipwright named James Dobin had his legs trapped under the ship. He died the next day, and this was considered a very bad luck omen. For the launching, there was no sponsor. No champagne bottle was broken. That custom had not yet been established. Rather, an elegant luncheon was served afterward in the Harland and Wolff dining room, and it included such dignitaries as Peary, Ismay, Morgan, and their wives and dignified guests. That day was also the birthday of Lord Peary's wife, and a cake had been prepared for the luncheon. The press who were covering the launch, as well as the company's executive and lesser dignitaries, went to the Belfast Grand Central Hotel. Here they enjoyed an extravagant lunch, champagne, and a dance band. Many thousands that had lined the riverbanks to watch the launching of the Titanic had picnicked for the afternoon. Also on hand during the launching was Titanic's sister ship, Olympic. She was newly completed and being ready to begin her career on the express North Atlantic route to America. As a publicity stunt, the White Star Line deliberately timed the start of Olympic's first voyage from Belfast to Southampton to coincide with the launch of the Titanic. The keel of the third gigantic vessel, known to be gigantic, would soon be laid down next to where the Titanic was just launched. So Titanic was towed by 5 tugs to the deep wharf. And it's a fitting out wharf that she's going to be at. Her fitting out would take almost another year with all of the grandeur befitting her status. With 3 stacks already installed on the Titanic, it was time for the 4th one to be put in place. The number 4 stack was actually a fake, a marketing feature, and no smoke ever belched from it. People attributed speed to the number of stacks on a ship, and the White Star Line wanted the impression of speed associated with the Olympic-class ships. However, the number 4 stack did provide ventilation for the ship's galley. But the fitting out would also incorporate some of the problems disclosed on the Olympic. The mattresses were too soft, accentuating the vibration from the engines. The first-class reception room needed 50 additional cane chairs and 10 tables because it was so popular. A potato peeler needed to be installed in the crew galley, and the first-class bathrooms needed cigar holders. It was also decided that the 4 first-class parlor suites could be enlarged to provide for enclosed promenades. Each of the private promenades was about 50 feet long, complete with mock oak beams. Another decision was to enclose the forward portions of Titanic's promenade deck with windows. Experience on Olympic had shown that ocean waves and spray would reach the first-class passengers as they strolled or relaxed on this deck, and this glassed-in feature was one that would externally differentiate between Olympic and Titanic. Work at the fitting-out basin progressed at a very frantic pace in order to meet the date of the Titanic's projected maiden voyage, March 20th of 1912. The ship's interior had been completed with paneling, carpeting, carved woodwork, furniture, fixtures. On the ship's exterior, workers are giving it another coat of black paint. Her funnels are all in place and painted with the White Star Line's buff colors. The davits that will hold the 16 wooden lifeboats are all in place. The 16 wooden lifeboats were painted in another yard location, and once tested, these were installed on the davits. The capacity of Titanic's lifeboats complied with the hopelessly outdated regulations of the British Board of Trade. Under the regulations, which had not been amended since 1894, a ship of 46,000 tons, such as the Titanic, was not required by law to carry any more lifeboats than one of 10,000 tons, even though it would be undoubtedly carrying many, many more passengers and crew. These regulations meant the Titanic had to carry lifeboats for only 962 people when she had a capacity for over 3,500. To his credit, Alexander Carlisle, who was Harland and Wolff's chief designer before he retired in 1910, recognized this deficiency, and his original plan incorporated 64 lifeboats, which were sufficient for everybody. But as discussions proceeded between builders and owners, priorities changed. Why spend money for lifeboats not required by the rules and clutter up the boat deck, which was the designated promenade deck for the second-class passengers? Carlisle was obligated to modify the numbers first to 40, then to 32, and then finally to 16. These 16 lifeboats were made up of 14 standard wooden boats, each 30 feet long and accommodating 65 people, and two 25-foot-long emergency cutters, designated number 1 and number 2, and each of those had a capacity for 40 people. The 16 lifeboats brought Titanic's total lifeboat seating capacity to 980, slightly more than the 962 required by the British Board of Trade. White Star Line was especially proud that its designers had added 4 canvas-sided collapsible boats, each with a seating capacity for 47, giving them a total of 196. This raised Titanic's total lifeboat seating capacity to 1,176 people, well in excess of the official regulations, even though it represented only 53% of the souls on board. Ironically, each pair of manually operated davits was capable of lowering 3 lifeboats in succession, and in fact could have been modified to lower 4, but they limited it to only 1 lifeboat. Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, publicly commented that, quote, "Passengers don't want their promenade decks cluttered with lifeboats. Titanic and Olympic were their lifeboats," unquote. Ismay's comments led both White Star Line and the press to herald both ships as practically unsinkable due to their advanced watertight bulkhead construction, and indeed considerable publicity was generated that highlighted the 16 watertight compartments with steel doors that could close within 25 seconds. Newspapers were already calling the Titanic the Wonder Ship, the Millionaire's Special. She was already being referred to as the Queen of the White Star Line. The Titanic also inspired lots of merchandising, such as the toilet soap provided to first-class passengers and also available for purchase to the London public. Then, Titanic's projected maiden voyage on March 20th, 1912 had to be delayed because of 2 mishaps to her sister ship, which you see here, the Olympic. The first incident occurred on September 20th, 1911, when the Olympic on her 5th voyage collided with a British warship called the Hawk off the Isle of Wight. Olympic was able to return to Southampton under her own power and no one was seriously injured, but it took 2 weeks for the damage for the Olympic to be patched up to sufficiently allow her to return to Belfast for permanent repairs, and those took over 6 weeks. To speed up the repairs, Harland and Wolff was forced to use Titanic's propeller shaft for the Olympic. That forced a delay on the completion of the Titanic. By November 19th, 1911, the Olympic was back in service, but in February the following year, she suffered another setback when she lost a propeller blade on an eastbound voyage from New York. On March 6th, she once again went back to Belfast for repairs, and that meant having to reposition the Titanic. To get the Olympic back in service as soon as possible, the Titanic contributed her propeller over to the Olympic. Here's what's interesting. On the Olympic's 9 voyages across the Atlantic, including her 2 mishaps, Captain Edward J. Smith had been in command. As the White Star Line's senior-most captain with 42 years of service, he was now reassigned to take command of the Titanic. He planned to make the round-trip maiden voyage with the Titanic and then retire. It was announced in the London Times that the Titanic's maiden voyage from Southampton to New York would be on April 10, 1912. On both sides of the Atlantic, publicity quickly spun up. Finally, all was complete, and on April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic pulled out into the River Lagan and towed through Belfast, Lough, en route to the Irish Sea for her trials. After a series of tests that included speed and turning trials and crash stops, Captain Smith and his officers, as well as the officials from Harland and Wolff, were pleased with Titanic's performance. By evening, Titanic returned to the entrance of River Lagan, where she dropped anchor. A Harland and Wolff boat arrived with additional pieces of furniture and related articles that quickly were loaded on board. The workboat also embarked shipyard staff and workers that had been aboard for the sea trials. Remaining on board was a group of 9 men, all top professionals at Harland and Wolff in their various trades. These men were the, quote, guarantee group, unquote, and they would sail on the maiden voyage to ensure that everything was in compliance with the contractual specifications. To be selected for the guarantee group was considered both an honor and a reward, and overseeing the guarantee group was Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer. Titanic now headed due south for her 36-hour trip to her designated home port of Southampton in England. She arrived at Southampton, England, shortly past midnight on April 4, 1912. Here she would have an additional week of preparations. April 5th was Good Friday. Titanic berthed at the new White Star dock in Southampton, and she was dressed in flags. Titanic was a massive ship, 882.5 feet long, 92 feet wide, and displacing, or weighing, if you will, 52,310 tons. It was 175 feet tall from the keel to the top of the 4 stacks or the funnels, almost 35 feet of which was below the waterline. The Titanic, at 11 stories high, was taller above the water than most urban buildings of the time. At the time, Titanic was the largest ever movable man-made object. The press labeled the ship unsinkable. She was 1,000 tons heavier than the Olympic because of the refinements made during construction, and the extra tonnage made her the biggest ship in the world at that time. However, for the Titanic, her time in Southampton was very hectic. The national coal strike of Great Britain had begun in January of 1912, with miners striking for minimum wage. One effect of the stoppage of coal shipments was that more and more shipments became idle, and widespread unemployment gripped British seamen. At Southampton, many third-class or steerage passengers, as well as some second-class passengers, were rebooked from idled White Star ships to the Titanic, much to their delight. Many of the third-class passengers were immigrants from Eastern Europe. On Saturday, April 6th, the hiring of the majority of Titanic's crew began in White Star Line's hiring hall, which was jammed with hundreds of seamen anxious to find work. By the end of the day, most of the operating crew had been obtained with the underlying emphasis of a British ship, a British crew for a British ship. Of the final 885 officers and crew of the Titanic, the deck department totaled 66 people, including Captain Smith and 7 ship's officers, able seamen, boatswains, lookouts, storekeepers, window cleaners, carpenters, masters-at-arms, medical staff with 2 ship's doctors, and a nurse specifically assigned for the first-class passengers. The engineering department comprised of more than 300 men, the largest group being the 200 in what was called the Black Gang, the coal stokers or the firemen, the coal trimmers. The largest crew component was service personnel, 421 men and women assigned to the victualling department. Of these, 322 were stewards who performed a variety of functions in each class's dining room, public rooms, cabins, and recreational facilities. For example, there were bath stewards. They were responsible for maintaining supplies in the communal bathrooms used by everyone except for a few first-class passengers. Bedroom stewards were assigned to each class, and in first class they not only cleaned the staterooms and made the beds, but were available to serve food or help passengers in dressing. Most stewards were poorly paid, relied on tips. Each first-class bedroom steward was responsible for 3 to 5 rooms. Second-class stewards had up to 10 rooms, and third-class stewards as many as 25 rooms. Of the 23 female crew on Titanic, 20 were stewardesses. 2 were cashiers, and 1 was a matron who oversaw the female crew members. The female stewardesses generally looked after the women passengers. And as part of the victualling department, 62 were employed in the galley as chefs, cooks, bakers, butchers, dishwashers, and they worked in the kitchens of all the various classes on board the liners. There was also a designated Hebrew cook for anyone requesting kosher food. Within the crew, there were many random jobs which didn't fit any particular category. Titanic and Olympic were the first ships to have facilities such as a gymnasium, a swimming pool, or a swimming bath, as it was called. There was a Turkish bath and a squash court. This meant that attendants had to be employed to staff these areas. There were also designated elevator attendants. The Titanic was equipped with a wireless telegraph, and the 2 operators had a special status as they were employees of the Marconi Telegraph Company. As the Titanic was officially designated a mail ship, 5 postal clerks, 3 Americans and 2 British were on board to look after the mail, especially the 200 sacks of registered mail. Included on the passenger list was Titanic's guarantee group that represented the shipbuilder, Harland and Wolff. Thomas Andrews headed the group and was accommodated in first class. The rest were in second class. The ship's 8-member orchestra was carried as second-class passengers. The band was actually split into 2 groups, and they were entirely separate from each other. Of the 887 crew aboard the Titanic, slightly more than 600 were from Southampton. And although the national coal strike ended on April 6th, it was too late to transfer new coal to Southampton. The only option was to scavenge coal from other ships in Southampton. So the Titanic had arrived with 1,880 tons of coal, and to this, 4,427 tons from 5 different ships in port, all owned by J.P. Morgan and his International Maritime Company. Coal was transferred over to the Titanic. Transferring the coal was long, labor-intensive affair for what the Titanic's group was called the Black Gang. It was also messy. Many of the newly hired crew had to clean off the fine coating of coal dust that would spread throughout the Titanic, on the decks and the staircases and the railings. Adding to the confusion, that Saturday was a general cargo that had begun to arrive, including 12 cases of ostrich feathers, ostrich plumes, 3 cases of tennis balls, 2 barrels of mercury, 2 cases of olive oil, 2 cases of grandfather clocks, and a marmalade machine. And also located in the forward hold was a brand new Renault town car owned by a first-class passenger. It had been estimated that there were probably some 30 cars being shipped on the Titanic to the United States. The final cargo totaled almost 560 tons and included 11,524 individual pieces. On Easter Sunday, April 7th, all was quiet at berth 44. No work was done on this day. The next day, Monday, April 8th, saw a more hectic pace of activity. Finishing work continued as carpets were fitted, paintwork was completed, curtains were hung, furniture was arranged. Large quantities of stores, including glassware and crockery and cutlery, were bought on board the ship. Titanic's potable water tanks are filled, and a huge supply of fresh food is taken on board, being brought by train to the dock and then carted over to the ships. 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fish are put into the large refrigerators and the storerooms on G deck. Also loaded into the ship's freezers are almost 1,800 quarts of ice cream. Titanic's provisions also include 15,000 bottles of beer, 1,000 bottles of wine, and 8,000 cigars. Tuesday, April 9th, was Titanic's final full day in Southampton. The next day, she begins her maiden voyage. Food and stores continue to be taken on board. A Board of Trade inspector comes on board to examine the ship, including the crew's cork-filled lifeboats. Captain Smith, her commander, performs his own full inspection of the vessel. From his first-class cabin on the Titanic, the 39-year-old Thomas Andrews wrote his wife, quote, "The Titanic is now almost complete, and I think I shall do the old firm credit tomorrow when we sail," unquote. All of the officers, except for Smith, spend the night of April 9th on the board, keeping regular watches and supervising the final night in port. With only a skeleton crew and without any passengers, the last night in Southampton is eerily quiet. 62-year-old Captain Smith spent a quiet night at his home in Highfield, a suburb of Southampton, with his wife Eleanor and their daughter Helen. His home would subsequently be destroyed during German bombs in World War II. At 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, April 10th, Captain Smith boarded the Titanic and received the sailing report. The long, straggling procession of firemen, trimmers, greasers, stewards, and others slowly made their way through the streets and the dockyard, eventually boarding the sleek new liner. Ismay, the chairman and the managing director of the White Star Line, boarded immediately after breakfast with his valet. Between 9:30 and 11:30 a.m., the 3 White Star Line boat trains arrived, carrying the first, second, and third-class passengers from Waterloo Station. Several of the Titanic's first-class passengers had arriving the day before, and stayed overnight at Southwestern Hotel, which was only a short distance from the berth. But the White Star Line dock was mobbed with passengers, with luggage, and with visitors. Slowly, the procession of passengers began to make their way aboard the Titanic. To be making the maiden voyage on this majestic ship had attracted the rich and the famous. Titanic passengers had already received notification of the company's limited liability for baggage and recommended that insurance be obtained. Among the first-class passengers boarding in Southampton was Lucy Martha Leslie, the Countess of Rothes, together with her parents, her cousin, and her maid. Her parents disembarked in Cherbourg. Also boarding was Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy. Other first-class passengers included William E. Carter from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, together with his wife. The Carters also brought with them their dogs, the King Charles Cavalier Toy Spaniel. Stored in the forward hold of the Titanic was their 25-horsepower Renault automobile. John and Nell Snyder of Minneapolis, Minnesota, both in their 20s, were returning from their honeymoon and boarded the Titanic in Southampton. Returning from a 6-week vacation was Major Archibald Butt, military aide to President William Howard Taft. He'd been vacationing with his partner, the painter Francis David Millet, with whom he shared a large mansion in Washington, D.C. Shortly before noon, the Titanic's sirens sounded her impending departure. Visitors from shore began to leave, as well as shore staff and harbor officials. Shortly after noon on Wednesday, April 19th, the Titanic singled up her lines as tugs arrived to assist her departure. Slowly, the giant ship moved away from her berth, people on the docks and on board waving and shouting their goodbyes. Down to the River Test and then across the English Channel to her first port of call, which is Cherbourg in France. Down in the Titanic's boiler rooms, the heat could build up to 125 degrees, and the men known as the Black Gang fed the huge 29 boilers one shovelful at a time. Nearly 6,000 tons of coal a day were needed to maintain the 22 knots. Then, near disaster, as the powerful suction of Titanic's propellers caused all 6 mooring ropes on the American liner New York to snap. The New York swung towards the Titanic, and it appeared that a crash was imminent. Quick action by the tugs Hector and Neptune saved the day and narrowly averted a collision. After some delay, the Titanic resumes her 24-mile trip down the English Channel en route to Cherbourg in France. At 1 p.m., Peter Fletcher, the bugler steward, announced the call for lunch with the tune, "The roast beef of Old England." For the passengers, this would be their first meal aboard. For those traveling first class made their way to the splendid dining salon where the ship's trio was already playing in the reception area. The privileged and pampered first-class passengers scanned the luncheon menu, and by 5:30 p.m. the Titanic had arrived in Cherbourg. She dropped anchor in Cherbourg Roads just off Cap de la Hogue. Here she will be met by the new White Star tenders, Nomadic and Traffic. Though the sea was choppy, the Nomadic was first alongside and discharged another 142 additional first-class passengers and 30 additional second-class passengers. The embarking passengers were tired and no doubt some grumpy. They'd had a long train ride from Paris, and they had to wait for the 2-hour delay because the Titanic and her near collision coming out of Southampton. Among the first-class passengers embarking that night in Cherbourg were 47-year-old John Jacob Astor and his new and pregnant wife, Madeline, who was 3 months shy of her 19th birthday. The wealthiest passengers on board, the Astors, are accompanied by John Jacob Astor's valet, Madeline's maid, Madeline's nurse as well. They also had with them their pet Airedale, Kitty. Benjamin Guggenheim, with his entourage, boarded the ship. He came on board with his mistress, a French singer, his personal secretary, his valet, and his chauffeur, along with his mistress's maid. Molly Tobin Brown from Colorado had booked first-class passage, anxious to get home, since she learned her grandson was ill, and later she would be given the nickname Molly. Perhaps the oddest couple to board in Cherbourg was 55-year-old Ella White, the wealthy widow of a Manhattan businessman who was short and stout, with an outspoken, often brash personality, and her 36-year-old companion, Marie Grice, young. They had a farm, and after vacationing in England and in France, they boarded the Titanic with expensive live poultry that they had purchased for their farm in New York. And every day Marie was taken below by a Titanic crew member to check on their chickens. They were kept in a separate kennel in the same areas where the dogs were. Traveling back to New York from a winter vacation in Europe, mostly spent at Cap Martin in the south of France, was Isidore Strauss, co-owner with his brothers of Macy's department store, and his wife Ida. They boarded in Cherbourg as well. 25-year-old Dickinson Bishop and his 19-year-old wife Helen, a young couple from Michigan, were returning from their honeymoon in Egypt, Italy, and Algiers, and it appears that she may have gotten pregnant on board the vessel. She had a Yorkshire Terrier, and while it was not, the passengers were not supposed to keep their dogs in their cabins, a blind eye was often given by the crew. Helen Bishop's toy Yorkshire Terrier called Frou Frou was allowed to stay in her cabin as the stewards considered it too pretty to be put among the bigger dogs and the chickens in the kennel. Once the first and second class passengers had embarked, the White Star tender Traffic came alongside, carrying 120 more third-class passengers for the Titanic and more mail. With everyone and everything secured on board, they made ready to sail overnight to her next port of call, which is Queenstown and Cove in Ireland. The bugle steward sounded the call for the first dinner aboard for all 3 classes, and the short voyage from Cherbourg to Queenstown was uneventful, and passengers had time to explore the new liner. Breakfast on the morning of the 11th was offered, and first-class passengers had wonderful choices. Following breakfast, an emergency full dress rehearsal was held for officers and crew, with alarm bells sounding, followed by the general gradual descent of the watertight doors. Crew members were wearing cork life jackets, posed for passengers, taking pictures, and when the Titanic took on new passengers, the crew conducted drills. As the Titanic glided through the Irish Sea, she slowed down on the approach to Queenstown. By 11:30 in the morning, she was riding at anchor in Queenstown. Earlier that morning, the streets had been quiet, but crowds were beginning to gather to catch a glimpse of White Star Line's new Queen of the Seas. Some had traveled 25 miles from Cork just for the experience to see the Titanic. At the White Star dock, the 123 additional passengers had been anxiously awaiting to board the tenders Ireland and America to be taken out to the Titanic. Baggage and mail are loaded first. Finally, the announcement is given, and they are making their way down the wharf to the waiting tenders. Most of these passengers are traveling 3rd class. These are the Irish emigrants ready to travel to New York, ready to travel and seek new opportunities. But protocol will be observed first, and 2nd-class passengers are given priority boarding the tenders. And while there are a few 2nd-class passengers, the only 1st-class passengers are Dr. William Minhan and his wife, Lillian. Finally, the Ireland and the America, the 2 tenders are loaded off, and they set for the Titanic. Arriving at the Titanic, the tenders are tied up in tandem. There's a few bumboats that are here as well. They're allowed to come on board and sell some of their Irish lace goods. The 1st and 2nd-class passengers are allowed to board, and for the Irish emigrants, a U.S. doctor now inspects their eyes and takes a look at everyone, and they must receive permission before they are allowed to board. A short aside. From 1848 to 1950, over 6 million adults and children emigrated from Ireland. Over 2.5 million departed from today's Cove, making it the single most important port of emigration. This exodus from Ireland was largely a result of poverty, crop failures, the land system, and certainly a lack of opportunity. Located outside the Cove Heritage Center is the statue of Annie Moore and her 2 brothers. Annie Moore became the first ever emigrant to be processed in Ellis Island in the United States when it officially opened on January 1st, 1892. A similar statue of Annie can be found at Ellis Island in New York. One other item of explanation. Today's Cove was also first called Cove, C-O-V-E, for the Cove of Cork. It was renamed Queenstown, Ireland in 1850 to commemorate the visit by Queen Victoria. After the Queenstown passengers had boarded, came the task of unloading from the tenders the passengers' trunks and the 1,400 sacks of mail. With the mail brought over from Queenstown, there would be a total of 3,600 sacks of mail on board the Titanic. 8 passengers actually disembarked here in Queenstown, ready to enjoy a holiday in Ireland. Titanic remained about 2 hours in the outer harbor, and at 1:30 p.m. the starboard anchor was raised. As 3rd-class passengers thronged the stem of the Titanic, which was their designated outer deck, a tiny dot appeared at the 4th funnel. To some, it seemed like the black specter of death looking down. The superstitious among the passengers saw this as an ill omen. In reality, it was the grimy face of a fire room stoker who climbed up for a bird's-eye view of the Irish port. As Captain Smith peered down from the Titanic's bridge wing to watch the tender with the disembarking passengers and the shore staff, An Irish bugler on the tender sounded a farewell tune. The 2 tenders accompanied the Titanic until her speed built up. From the tender, a final photograph was snapped by Francis Ground. For Titanic's passengers and crew, it was now 6 days across the Atlantic. The day after the Titanic departed Queenstown, the local newspaper, the Cork Examiner, described the ship in detail and wrote, "The dangers of the seas are practically non-existent on this latest magnificent vessel." And so as P.W. Fletcher, the bugler steward, sounded the call for lunch, the Titanic sped on to her rendezvous with destiny. And we shall continue our story from Queenstown to New York, Monday at 7 p.m. and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Same link, same time. To travel is to live is to travel. Thank you for joining me this evening on our armchair travel journey. This is Jennifer Reynolds. This is the Titanic, and I look forward to welcoming you back for our next session next week. Travel strong.